Hey guys, let's give it up for Tom, John, and Nicole putting on the conference. The people that are running the conference are actually serving the food. That was pretty sweet. Are we ready? So, my name is Anthony Franco. I'm president and one of the founders of EffectiveUI. The panel today that we're going to discuss is going to be really lightweight, something that's, I think, good after a long day of technical discussion. We're going to have a little bit of fun with this. I'll let the rest of my panelists introduce themselves, but the topic of this panel is how do we as developers take some ownership in getting what we want when talking to executives. We'll start with Eva. Please introduce yourself.
Hi. My name is Eva. I'm super video. I am.
Here's your intro here.
Am I loud enough?
Yeah.
Well, I'll adjust in a moment. But like I said, my name is Eva Supermanium. I am the current product manager of Flex SDK. But I was actually on the engineering team for 7 years. I started off as a junior developer, became a more advanced developer, became a lead. So I led about 5 or 6 engineers on our team, and then moved over to product management just like a month and a half ago. So I definitely participated in several release cycles, being part of the engineering management team, and having to really interface between the devs and upper management, having to do that sort of translation of priorities and risks, and being asked to, eliminate risk overnight and things like that. And so I think I have a lot that I can share about what people do wrong when talking to engineering management.
Mike?
So my name's Mike Quadrillo. I'm with Digital Primates. So I'm actually going way back, just kind of an old school embedded developer. I managed to crawl out of the cave they kept me in, and work my way up into being a consultant, running projects, and interacting with clients all over the world and trying to get projects done. So to those ends, much like what Pete was saying, I've got the development chops. That's what I used to do. But these days I run more projects, so I've done both sides of the fence. I get to see it, and I've also seen a lot of people who succeeded really well at being able to work their way up through development and being able to get what they want. I've seen a lot of really excellent developers who've just not ever quite been able to make that transition. And there's only a few things that I think hold them down, so hopefully we'll cover some of those today.
My name is Andy Powell. I work for Universal Mind as a solutions architect. And I started out as kind of a corporate developer. We were a team of about 5 or 6, and I worked my way up the ladder, and eventually got to the point where I was running IT departments. And I decided that was really kind of boring, and went the consulting route, and so I've kind of been doing that ever since. And so I've moved kind of that same progression you had in like sort of running projects now, and moving more into that side of it as well.
My name is RJ Owen, and I have a similar story to a lot of people here, where I got a background in computer science, started off doing a lot of production level development, and then I've been involved in sort of running the team from the technical perspective, being the tech lead and the architect and doing that kind of stuff. And I've also had the privilege over the last couple of years of being in a company that really kind of blew up. I was the 10th or 14th or somewhere around there employee, and now it's close to 100 people.
Blew up with good.
Oh yeah, like a good inflating blow up, not like burning and dying blow up. But I've gotten to be middle manager is an ugly, evil term in most people's minds, so I don't want to say it, but I guess I'm in the middle of the company and I do some management. And figure that out, but I still do a lot of project work with a lot of clients, and still do some coding myself, so try to stay on top of things. But over the past couple of years, I've learned to talk to spiky-haired people in button-down shirts, so that I could, get what we need to be done. So
Spiky-haired people in button-down shirts?
It's not that spiky today. It's like
curious about you guys. So, how many folks here are developers? Most have. Management overhead?
How many of you are Belagians?
Read an email that's a page long or 2 pages long. They need a high-level synopsis. I think that's something that we were talking about. Being able to boil it down and presenting it to them such that they understand what's going on. Not, at least at Adobe, not all of our upper management are developers. Many are, but some aren't. So boiling it down, and what they want to know is, you know, is the project going to slip? Is this going to cost extra? Do you have everything you need? What are the dependencies? And like up-leveling that, making that very obvious at the get-go.
Yeah, to hit what you want, to cut you off, is sort of the idea of understanding the perspective of who you're answering a question for, right? Because if somebody I'm working with on an engineering team asks me a question, it can be worded exactly the same as somebody who's running the project. They really want different information. So it may be the same question, but it's different information and tailored your response to the audience. The only other thing I'd say is early and often, which is, you know, if there's complexity to something that you're getting, the worst time, and the time that most people have the worst trouble accepting that, is when you hear on the day of the deadline or around those things, well, it's just really complex. Oh, great, that's cool, that's really useful information like a month ago. So early and often, it's the idea that, hey, yeah, there's complexity, I'll keep letting you know where we're at, keep letting you know what's going on, but it's complex. Let's talk about it in short little segments. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, that was good. I was going to say that, I mean, there's lots of analogies that people have heard all the time about, or that we've all used for how software works. There's lots of good sports analogies.
I was telling them to not talk too many sports.
It's kind of like women's field hockey. No, there's lots of analogies, and that can work to an extent. And then there's the cone of uncertainty. If you've never seen the cone of uncertainty, it says at the beginning of your project we don't know shit, so it might be a whole lot of money and it might be free. And then at the end of your project, we'll probably know how much to charge you. And that's not really super helpful to executives either. So you kind of have to find something in the middle where you can put a stake in the ground and say, I think it's going to be about this much and why. But the best analogy I've ever heard is it's kind of like construction, except instead of building you're building out of wood or metal or something, it's like you're building it out of kittens. Because they're moving all the time, and they're growing, and they're changing, and they're licking themselves and scratching each other. And
Visuals great.
Visuals so good. I don't know if that's good when talking to executives, though. I'll get back to on that.
Rather more about a kid. It's great.
How do you follow that? You know, it's really, you know, an exercise in setting expectations. You know, everybody knows that we don't know everything when we start, so you know, a good discovery and design exercise will help eliminate all that. And then, you know, hopefully, once you get, you know, to actual development, you know, people on the whole team, you know, stakeholders and everybody else understand what the hell's going on. But you know, it's, you know, clear expectation setting and making sure that communication is, you know, open and honest with both directors.
To add to that just for a second, it's like you just said, that makes sense, is not what we're promising. This is something that we cut ourselves off for being sports developers all the time. We want to impress people. We want to tell them how great we are and the magic we do. But by basically very quickly saying something will be easy or giving those sort of off-the-cuff estimations of, that'll take me an hour, we do ourselves more disservice than anything.
Yeah, the worst thing you can do is overcommit and underdeliver. Absolutely. I mean, that's a death knell for anybody.
Well, and just that sort of off-the-cuff, like, well, that'll take an hour or two. Well, you know, you're setting a bad expectation. You know, the reality is, if you want people to acknowledge that software is complex, you don't have to drone on about it, but you have to actually put some thought in and manage the complexity for yourself to realize that it's complex and you may not know everything yet.
I refuse to give an estimate without at least getting one day to do a prototype. I just said no, because when I first became a developer, I just wasn't hitting my dates, and it's embarrassing. Or I would hit my dates, but I was working like 18 hours a day every weekend, and I was miserable. So what I told my manager was, you can't just come to me and ask me for an estimate, because right now, yeah, you know, it seems like something I could do in 6 weeks, but I have no idea what that means for the tools or the integration or blah, blah, blah. So I need 1 day to prototype it. I'm sure in the grand scheme of things, you could wait 1 day for me to do a little base level prototype and add some validity to my estimates. you have the complete right to ask that. They're asking you to come up with an estimate, you could have them carve you out one day to try to put some legitimacy behind your estimate.
It's ironic, I find developers to be optimistic on how long it's going to take you to do something and pessimistic on scope. How do you, how many here would describe themselves as optimists on how you look at something, that's only going to take me like 2 hours. I've read like 5 tweets on those monkeys' cries. So anybody here describe themselves as an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to doing estimates?
Only one person, so that's great.
Are you an optimist or a pessimist?
What are the rest of you?
Another analogy that I use from construction, I don't think construction always works. Construction, you have really how many square feet you're building, how many levels it's going to be, basically the cost per square foot that a building costs. It's a very, very structured and mature industry. It's more like, I always use the analogy, I don't use kittens, but I use city planning. So you look at how cities plan, they lay the roads and the highways in certain spots, and they know what that's going to be like, and they kind of let the city fill in. You've heard the words waterfall versus agile. Cities are built more in an agile process, where buildings are actually...
You've obviously never been to downtown Atlanta.
Or yeah.
And I'm building a house presently, let me tell you, it's maybe immature, but the concept of estimation...
It's always 2 weeks. Everything's 2 weeks.
Yeah. I've been an architect that is 6 days away from finishing stuff now since September.
I think there's an important thing to add on this too, though, that the complexities of software development it's a really big term. And the more important context to set around this is that it's the complexity of doing UI development. And that there's this whole other layer of unknown that requires a lot of user research and user testing when it comes to building a UI. If I was designing a database, my estimates would be a lot closer to right on because the unknown unknowns are fewer and farther between. But when it's a UI, I think it's harder.
I don't know if I agree with you there. And by that, I don't agree with you. I mean, you're assuming that you're going to build a database, and that means you know what the fields are and what needs to go into it, so yes, it's easy. I also think if you had all those knowns going into UI, it'd be more predictable. But if you think about designing a database, well, same thing, requirements are in flux, what's going on, it doesn't get any easier. And I think the problem is that maybe in this whole UI world that we're in right now, people are starting to acknowledge the UI, they're more willing to consider it, so there might be more change, more thought going into those things. So I think I agree with you that right now, the complexities of UI seem to be more. I think it's just, again, representative of the amount of change that goes into something.
I think one of the things that RJ might be referencing to is IBM actually did a study where they saw that 80% of bugs are actually usability issues. And if we address those usability issues up front, which means you have to be a lot more flexible in the UI design. So this crowd is a really unique crowd in software development because we really have to think about human interaction with the software that we build. And that's another layer of complexity, like figuring out how humans interact with software as a whole other layer of complexity on top of how you build a database.
And that's good. I think the point there is that complex things take longer and have more variance.
I don't know if I had a point, but okay.
Well, I'm going to pretend you had a point. And I'll answer it. Complex things take more time than simple things. I agree. So if the database is the simplest part of things, then yes, by all means, I agree it's going to take less time. I'm just saying any level of this software development process can have immeasurable complexity which goes on forever if there's unknowns and significant unknowns.
And yeah, you have a question back here.
Yes, so here you're talking about how complex it is and different analogies and everything else. The way that I see some of this, and I wanted to get your feedback on this, is that the idea of explaining the complexity, explaining how long it's going to take in software development, it ends up being a negotiation. How much you're willing to get, how much they're willing to give, and then also that negotiation goes back to the information. Because they want to give you some information, but not others, so the way they can lead you in and before they hit you with, oh, and by the way, you got to do this and this. Now, on the other hand, you're trying to hold back information and complexity. So I'm curious, what is the approach that you all use and how to work with them on this negotiation? Because that's what
Yeah, great question. So first of all, we're giving out a couple of EffectiveUI books. We're going to give out one for the first good question. So Drew, could you give him one of the EffectiveUI books? That'd be great. Second, I'll start with that and let the panel do it. In essence, EffectiveUI is a services industry, right? And to be truthful on how we negotiate a contract, it looks very simple. Give us a bunch of money and we'll figure it out along the way. And that's really hard to sell, right? But that's truthfully how software development, everybody's been a part of software development. You look at a huge requirements document, how often does the scope actually reflect when it's done, the requirements document you started with? So there's a trust factor that you have to establish, and it's hard to do, especially in your relationships, right? It's a relationship business. It's really hard to establish trust when in a business that inherently all you're doing is solving false errors. So the negotiation is we find ourselves it's easier to negotiate on the second project. On the first project we give a little bit, and on the second project all of a sudden everybody starts to understand, okay, I see how this works, I trust you, I trust your team, I trust the talent. So establishing that big amount of trust up front is very difficult and almost impossible. I'll let you guys go ahead.
I would just say, this won't be a surprise to any of my fellow panelists. I'm not a big fan of the idea of negotiation, of holding back information, or in any way not getting it. And I feel that, honestly, if I'm going to be involved in a project, then I need to be ruthlessly direct in the way that I get information out of things. And anything less than that is doing a disservice to both my client and me.
And that's definitely the way to deal with negotiation.
Yes, it's the many must die, so one shall live sort of philosophy. We're just going to change this clause and say Labriola at the top.
Opinions expressed by Michael Labriola.
Really likely get you fired.
So yeah, basically don't do what he says.
Hey, it's all your call.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide.
There was more question.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, shoot. Ben?
I think it's worth mentioning something I've learned in estimating is it's easy to blame it on maybe like optimistic developers, and certainly that's true to an extent, but there is a reality to estimating that there's an infinite upper limit that you can go to, but there's a hard lower limit. So even if you're fairly accurate in saying some feature is going to take 10 hours, it still has the potential to go to 40 or 80, but it's never going to go to negative 20, right? And that fact means that your estimate is going to extend. It's never going to get lower.
Yeah, it's an estimate. This is an estimate if X, Y, and Z are true, right? There's always exceptions and caveats as you put in estimates. It's a good point. All right, go ahead.
Just kind of an observation or a question I've been faced with before. We're talking about how to deal with management. And this is a real life situation. My manager would often come to me and say, "How long will it take you to do it?" And I would have to say, "Well, what do you do what? Just to make this work." You see, and so you're really fed with little breadcrumbs of information. You don't have really much to work on. And just to try to elicit that from, it was almost a futile operation.
Yeah, you're actually getting to a topic that we'll discuss a little bit later. But one of the things you mentioned is
my point.
Yeah.
What in the world do you do about that?
Yeah, it's hard when you're working with management that first of all has never written a line of code. It's very difficult. How many people have done that? That's currently true. It's tough. It's tough. But and that's
work with management who have written a line of code.
I'm sorry?
I want to know how many people have worked with management who have written a line of code.
Yeah, how many have worked? Yeah.
As your management
Did you hear that? How many people are currently working with a manager that has written code? All right, so it's about 50-50. But this is a highly technical crowd, so that's not too surprising.
I think you're really right about the trust angle, which is why I think in most service businesses, a lot of times it's sort of bid-win. You get the customer to accept
Yeah, we come across that all the time.
Where you could make up
where we
on
lose
a second, third, and fourth profit.
Yeah.
You can also lose your shirt on the first.
That actually makes a high profit the first time they're involved with a new customer.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good point. And bid-win, we don't participate in those kinds of deals.
Can you repeat the comment?
Sorry?
Can you repeat it?
Oh, sorry. He's involved in a lot of, I got to remember to do that. He's involved in a lot, he's noticed a lot of companies bid to win, and they'll lose their shirts on the first one. He was talking about trust, right? Bid to win, establish a trust so you can earn it on the second one. The problem that we've seen when we've established that, you set the bar to what software development should cost. And those projects typically are not profitable for a services organization. So it's very difficult for a services organization to earn money when you're only doing bid to win. And there's always going to be somebody else out there that's going to bid. Always. All right, we got a lot of these. We want to go. Okay, one more question. Well, we're actually, it's covered just a little bit. It's a great question. It's a great. We're gonna move on. We actually get to a little bit of that.
I've tried to cram as many ideas as I can into this brief because I'm really too weak and too stupid to make a decision. So let me ask a question in order to give the illusion that I actually give a shit. Yeah.
Also in front of that meeting. It was a great segue question. So what questions should we be asking to make sure we're solving the right kind of problems? It's a touch on this, and we'll get into the quality versus milestone question in a little bit. But how do we make sure we're asking the right types of questions to make sure we're solving the right types of problems? I'll go ahead and open this to
Right types of questions. That's pretty specific. So what's happening?
you want any to be specific?
No, I just think, I guess the idea is, I guess maybe that's the answer. But I guess the idea is, much to what was said before, if I'm trying to find, okay, let me back up. I can't reasonably expect one of my developers, and I certainly won't, answer a question about how something's going to take or what I have to do to solve it until I understand the problem. Okay? It's not a reasonable thing to ask someone to what it's going to take to do something, or what we have to do to solve a problem. And my answer specifically to that one, but in general to this, is that I always provide a range, and I'm willing to limit that range and keep making it smaller the more information I get. And that's, that begins to develop a process of trust as well, the idea of, okay, here's where I'm at. Give me more information, I'll give you more information, and we'll figure out how to continue to narrow that range. But what questions should we be asking? The answer is everything you need to do to feel comfortable about the problem. I mean, I don't let a developer start on something unless they can tell me what the problem they're trying to solve is. People that go off half-cocked and start solving a problem when they don't understand it are absolutely 100% doomed to do one of two things. Most likely fail, certainly exceed the budget, and usually a combination of both.
And over-engineer what they're supposed to do.
And over-engineer the crap out of what they're supposed to be doing.
Or get really lucky.
And we actually on the Flex team, this is like codified into our feature specifications, into our feature kickoffs. The first slide or the first section has to be what is the goal of what you're doing. And sometimes, at least on our team, we're a pretty large organization. By the time it comes down to the individual developer, it's been boiled down to technical requirements. But the developer should sort of step away from what those technical requirements are and look at the broader picture. What was the thinking, the decision making around having this feature of all the other features possible during the release be the one that was chosen and assigned to them? What are they trying to solve? And if you can have it, if your developer can very easily explain that, what the goal of the feature should be, they're going to do a good job.
How many here has been a part of a project that you only understood this slice of it, and if you had understood the whole thing, you would have coded it differently? The rest of you are
not willing to admit that.
I'm interested, Deepa, what are the things that you ask when you're picking which things to put into the SDK or whatever? Like when Mike wanted the ability to theme Flex Builder pink with unicorns, you guys decided that wasn't important for Flex Builder 4.
Well, I'm learning this now, in my new role, exactly what are the types of questions to ask, how to step back and look at the bigger picture. I mean, obviously we look at a lot of things. What do we need to do to evolve the framework, to continue to grow our developer base, how do we stay competitive? And once you sort of, figure out where you want to go with the product, from there, feature ideas come together, and then, I have my feature backlog is like 500 items, right? And then we sort of scan that, we validate it with customers, and we end up with a small list that we're going to tackle for, say, like the next 3 releases. But whenever I talk to, it's like we're actually having our kickoff for the next release on Thursday. I'm working on my slide deck right now. And it's this little story that I'm walking the whole development team through. Like, look, back in October, I started doing this, and we had this huge list. I talked to these kind of customers, and we knew those were the ones we wanted to target. Now the list came here. Then I went out and did more validation and had people helping prioritize, and now we're at this list. And now you, developer X, I think you would be great at solving feature Y, and you have the whole backstory. And hopefully they feel inspired and passionate and understand why we want to do that.
So where in that list of 500 is the unicorn?
Well, branding Flash Builder is something that we have to think about. And you can brand it however you want.
But I think that the important thing that you're hitting on there again though is that you go out and you do user research. You go out and you talk to different organizations and you say like, what do you guys want? What do you guys want? And you've done that with us. I know you play that game where you're like, you've got $100
$100
you can invest in. Yeah. So I think that's again sort of reframing the conversation with your executive in light of user research and user acceptance is a big part of it. And just trying to get them to understand that like user acceptance is really the only important thing compared to not the only important, but by far the most important thing. If no one uses this, then who the heck cares? Getting them to understand that fact first, then we can start doing the right kind of research that leads to answering the right, or finding the right problem to solve.
So, is anybody familiar with the concept of the 5 whys? Okay, so a few people. Way back when the dude that started Toyota came up with this concept, basically if you start with a problem, you ask why, within 5 whys you can get to the root cause of it. And so I think that kind of methodology works sometimes, but not always, especially when you start getting to usability testing and stuff like that. And actually, it's one of the things we've seen in usability testing is sometimes this feature that executives thought would be solving this really hard problem is a feature that nobody wanted to use.
Sometimes, in my experience anyway, they can't answer the first why.
Yeah.
Right. And nobody, and again,
That's when warning bells should go on.
Yeah, you should throw up the slide when you have a chance again, but nobody should be afraid to ask why. If you're coming to with a requirement, and this is something you're going to implement, you have to feel passionate about what you're doing, or life just sucks, okay? So when somebody comes to you with a feature to implement, for something to do, the question why is an extraordinarily legitimate question. What is this going to help? What is this going to do? Why does this matter? Those are all great questions. And frankly, as a manager, sometimes I have a client who implements something or wants to implement something that is stupid. And it's true. Sometimes people are stupid. It happens once in a while with me, but overall, people are stupid. So, there's a question, or there's a client that comes out.
You're calling everybody stupid. I think you're all stupid.
Well, I was mainly talking about Mike. But no, the reality is that sometimes there's stupid things that happen. People do things for the wrong reason. It might be because they perceive it as a user issue, or they perceive it in some way, and so be it. And there are times that the developer will ask me, why do I have to implement this? And I'll say, you know what, honestly, I don't necessarily feel it's the right solution at this point either. Here's why though. The client feels this is extraordinarily important, so let's go ahead and give it our best effort. Let's go ahead and do this, and perhaps we're wrong. Perhaps this is really going to make the use case for them. But making sure people understand why they're doing something and what it's all about makes so much of a difference in the whole perception of what we're doing. So the number one question I would ask is, why? What difference does this make in the final product? If I understand that and I internalize it, not only does it make me feel better about what I'm doing, which is a passive gain, it's something that happens, it also is more likely for me to implement that feature in the way that is consistent with what the long-term strategy of the product is.
Yeah, I don't think it's a. You caveated your answer by saying, maybe everybody should be asking why. In my experience, I feel that developers aren't asking enough questions. So, I don't know what your experience is on that, but the more questions, like you said, how could you be estimating something? How could you be working on something if you don't understand the context of the problem? So you need to understand the context of the problem before you can actually start coding and estimating.
And a way to do that very concretely is to think of it from the outside and use the opposite of what developers do.
Yeah.
And look at cost of ownership, because that's the executive
TCO, ROI, yeah, all the acronyms that we all
Think about cost of
know.
ownership. What does it cost to own this chunk of flex data?
Don't forget to repeat that.
Okay.
Everyone else will have said it.
Okay.
No one else heard.
I forgot the initial question, but what,
It's basically look at the executive's challenge of managing the cost of ownership over time.
so understanding the executive's point of view that they are held accountable to a budget and to an ROI on the product. Yeah, there was a question over here?
Yeah, so you asked all these questions. I think most of them know you do so why. So I found myself in a situation where I've asked why and I'm told, but it has to be like ingredients and a lot of line ingredients. And I'll say, well, it's not a good choice. Right? So we can go in there too. So ultimately, if I have from
So the question is, what if they're making the wrong decision? What if you're being asked to do something that you inherently know is wrong? And we're going to get to that in a little bit, okay? It's a great question. We're going to get to that in a little bit. I'm actually going to jump ahead. This directly answers this gentleman's question here. Doing it right is no excuse for not meeting the schedule. So what should you do when you're handed deadlines you can't meet within a certain quality level? And this is the quality balance that you were talking about, where you have this schedule versus quality of code. We all want to build good quality code. Executives and developers alike share this. They want the product to be functional, scalable, and quality. But how do you manage that with the next quarter of the release?
It's the evil three-sided pyramid, right? Of fast, cheap, or good, and you get to pick two.
Yeah.
And if you use the word very, you only get one. That's how it works. Want it very cheap, it's not going to be good. It's not going to be fast.
We always tell people, there's three variables that you can work with. There's scope, time, and budget. And some of those are going to be immovable. If time is immovable, then okay, scope and budget can move. If scope's movable, then pony up. But those three variables really define what you're going to get and when you're going to get it.
Well, I think that I don't want to sound like a broken record, but there's also, the fourth thing is user acceptance. And so we can sacrifice that for one of the other three, and then you're going to get, your lime green button that nobody wants to click, or we can, spend the time and do the research to figure out what the right thing to solve is before we tackle our problem. And so I think if you can frame it that way, and if you can sell the research piece and sell like the importance of doing the user acceptance testing, then you go into it with a lot more information, and you're less apt to have the situation where they say, I want it to be purple with a picture of my kitten on the front because I love Mrs. Fluffles or whatever. You know what you're building, and you can always go back to that testing, and you can say, well, our user interviews and our testing showed X, Y, Z, and that's why we think that's the best choice.
I think user acceptance falls in the category of good though.
Yeah, quality.
And it'll be surprising, but I'm going to go with a counterpoint to this. Which is, at the end of I know it is, it's terribly shocking that I would in any way take a dissenting opinion. But the basic premise is that unicorns and purple and lime green are bad. Okay? And one thing I'd like to redirect this back to is that while we may have personal preferences in this, and we may even believe something is one way or another, if at the end of the day we're trying to build something, I agree that it's great to believe in and see what's there. But I think that's external to at least what I'm trying to answer. I think that user acceptance, if it's part of what we're trying to do, absolutely needs to be figured in, and meeting the user acceptance criteria is part of being good. But if somebody's asking us to build something with unicorns and purple and works this way, even if we don't like it, good means meeting that specification to some degree.
Sure, yeah, like at the end of the day, if you're working for a client, you're working for a client. But I think if you've got a problem with the quality, then and you've got good reasons for that problem, then it's worth bringing up. And I'm just saying the way that you back yourself up, the way you support your reasons, is by trying to convince your client to do the research to define what is and what is not the right solution for them. And if they don't want to do that, or if they hire you specifically to make a purple unicorn pony because that's what you're good at, Mike, then I think that you should go right ahead and do that for them.
And on that topic, RJ, you jerk, it's actually probably a really good thing in general, which is the concept of conflict, right? The reality is that for whatever reason, the concept of conflict and argumentation and all these things have negative connotations.
Argumentation.
And argumentation. Okay. Making an effective argument. Are doing so.
Yeah.
Argumentation is actually a word, buddy. Look it up. In either case, you're next. I've got a bottle. In either case, yeah. All right. Here's my microphone. The point is that I'm pro-conflict, so I'm for arguing this out. I am very pro-conflict.
Until
yeah, if you're not. But no, I'm all for arguing out. Go argue it out. Get to the point where somebody makes a decision, but at the end of the day, you also need to be comfortable. If you're willing to engage in an argument, that's a fantastic thing. Go argue about it, go explain why you're passionate about it, use user research or use your own simple experience that I can't believe you're doing this, it's the ugliest thing I've ever seen. It doesn't matter. Make whatever argument you can, but then I guess the other part of that is that at the end of the day, once the decision is made, go with it. You know, because you know you.
But I did want to ask you a really good question here on this subject. So one of the arguments I usually make when I ask about this quality versus time decision is Adobe, Apple, Microsoft, big software, like pros at software development. You guys don't commit to a schedule, publicly released schedule. You guys don't commit to scope. Aren't schedules important? And then aren't they important to Adobe? Why don't you do that?
Well, they're definitely important to us, obviously, but you're right, we don't publicize our release dates ahead of time. And that is hard for people, obviously, and it's problematic. I talk to people when in my customer business, like, how much have you looked at Flex for? Well, honestly, they don't raise their hands. They're like, we can't use a technology that's in beta for a product or a project for a client, and because you guys don't tell us when it's going to ship, I'm not going to invest my time learning something that's in beta until I know, okay, you know what, I can actually switch my project over to it on this date because that's when it's going to be public. And I wrestle with that internally a lot. I wish we could be more open about some of our release dates. We choose to do that for a number of reasons, and potentially change. But we work across an entire stack, so it's really hard to commit to a release date at one point product along that stack because there are dependencies up and down that stack, right? So if any part of the chain within the Flash platform runs late, let's say one of the Flex features depends on a Flash player feature. If that stretches late, then the Flex feature stretches late, then the builder integration stretches late. So we have that scheduling problem times 10 because the entire stack is sort of innovating together and working in lockstep. And to mitigate risk around that, to mitigate expectations as well as set priorities appropriately, we schedule internally, but we don't commit to findings. But we do say things like, first half of the year, or first quarter of the year, or second quarter of the year, or whatnot. And I know it sounds like we're hedging our bets.
You are.
In a little bit, right. And, honestly, there were some times during the Flex 4 release where we were like, whoa, you know what? This is a hole, and we have to address it. And we're going to have to just suck it up and, push things out by a month in order to address it. Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the release meets the goals and the criteria that we had set at the beginning. And so that's why we do it. And it's frustrating for people who want to build against releases and they don't know the ship dates. But, those are our reasons for doing it. I kind of wanted to address this question too. When you're given requirements and told to do it by the state, and you're starting to run through it in your head, and you realize that it's a foolish expectation, it's only a fool's dream, start getting that sweaty hands and a gross taste in your mouth, be frank. Say that then and there. Don't be shy to be like, you know what, I think you're being unreasonable, or oh, something's going to have to give in order for us to hit it at this date, or just my gut feeling is that this sounds fishy, and I'm just going to say that. Don't hide that. Don't ever feel shy to say that. Because what's the worst that can happen? Either you deliver on time, and that's great, and no one will remember your doubt, or you were frank from the beginning, and then it ends up playing out that way, and something's going to have to slip. And resist the urge to say, I told you so, because that's never a good thing. But in the back of your mind, you know, I told you so. I knew this was going to work out this way, so be open about that.
I've also worked with developers that will do that on every ask that is asked. That they hedge their bets on everything.
Well, then no one's going to take you seriously if you do that, right? Also, something that I've worked with developers who will complain about something. They'll, you know, bitch and moan, but they never offer any sort of solution, saying like, you know what, this is dumb, this is ridiculous, why are we doing this, blah, 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 blah. Okay, what would you do to fix it? Silence. And it's like, you know what, then automatically, I'm not looking to you for advice or input, because if you can't offer a way to fix it, or, hey, you know, with this thing, if you want me to deliver it by the end of the summer, well then I think these particular features need to be like B featured. They're not A featured, something like that. You need to be frank, but you also need to offer solutions. If you're just one of those developers who's gonna like moan, and not offer anything constructive, well then people are gonna start tuning you out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Realizing that your tech lead or your manager, or even sometimes your client, has probably been in that situation too, and knows that a lot of things are bad, and knows that, you know, there are lots of flaws in this place or that place. And so, especially from like a career development perspective, when they see someone who's like invested in the problem or invested in the organization, trying to find ways to solve it, that just shows so much, I don't know, ability and maturity as an employee or as a vendor. So I think that's a great way to build relationships in your team or with your client.
And just sorry if I'm going to be too here, but along with what you just said, it's not just about offering options though, it's about also standing behind and offering a recommendation. I'm comfortable going in and saying, here's 3 options, and here's my recommendation. There's a big difference between those 2 things. 3 options is non-committal. 3 options is, I'm still putting it on you, you're going to choose one, I reserve the right later to not stand behind what I just did. 3 options in a recommendation is, I'm putting my effort behind this is the way we think it should go. You may not choose it, but I've made a clear line and I've made a stand, and that's important. And psychologically, the developer who comes to me and says, as their manager, hey, I've got these 3 things, there's 3 different ways I can solve it, this is the one I think I want to do, and it's going to take me an extra week. That person not only wants respect, that person, in my mind, if it takes them a week, and even if it takes them a week and a day now instead of a week, they're so much further ahead. So, anyway, is what it is.
Yeah, and building the, I would say before you do that with a client, make sure that you sort of propose that to your team too. And if you've got a PM working on the project, especially, consult with them. Don't just sort of think you're going to have this cool maverick moment in front of a client, because it's just important to get everybody on the same. That wasn't you. That was a great point you made. I'm 100% in line with the point that you most recently made, Mike.
All right, any questions on this, or would you like us to move on? Move on? Okay.
Actually, I got one.
Yeah.
This type of scenario happens, and what's your guys' approach as far as making sure it doesn't happen next time? Right. I mean, I think that's a big thing that a lot of people forget about, having like a recap after a situation happens in the second project, or even if you're in the same project, next iteration.
Postmortems. The question is really, what do you do when it goes wrong once? How do you make it not go wrong again? It's just a personal thing. All right, there's 2 things here. First of all, don't dwell on your failures at the same time, because there are people who just dwell on their failures. Okay, don't dwell on your failures, but you also are remiss if you don't acknowledge them. If I fail at something, let me look at it, let me figure out what I did wrong, let me acknowledge it, and then I need to let it go. Because the next iteration isn't the last. I can do something different now, I can accomplish something more. But if I don't figure out what I did wrong, if I don't take the time to do it, I am going to repeat it. I'm absolutely so. So anytime something goes wrong, there has to be a postmortem. There has to be a sit down and discuss what went wrong and what we could have done better. If we're not doing that, we're not learning. I mean, I primarily learn through mistakes, meaning that I mostly make mistakes. And I'm okay with that because I learn something each time. But if I don't do that, then I'm just an idiot making a lot of mistakes. So you heard it, learning and making mistakes.
I'm going to go ahead and move on.
Trying to communicate here really is near parity performance. Right. Okay. Now this is a term that is used as a blatant attempt to mislead consumers because we're really too cheap to improve our product's formulation. Yes, we are.
I love his side comments. He has a couple of them. So this goes more directly to the green, the lime green question. Is there an effective way to tell executives that the company is building something that you believe will provide little to no value. So somebody tells you, we want to build this because of X, Y, and Z, or we want to build this, we want it to be lime green, or we want a unicorn for some reason that's the thing today. How do you let them know that that decision?
I keep coming back to this one project that I worked on because we had this feature that everybody involved in the project told them this feature is something that just doesn't work. Your users aren't going to use it. All this stuff, and they said no, we have to have this. We have to have this. We have to have this. We get through usability testing, and the users that we tested with said, no, we don't like that. There's no use for that, and that's kind of when the light went on. So that's where usability testing comes in, and you prototype something out, you put it through usability testing, and then you figure out is that something that people are actually going to use? Because if they're not going to use it, it's not worth a damn to put in your application to begin with.
I mean, I agree obviously with the idea of usability testing, but either way, I think the most important thing is implicit in the question that you tell them. I think it's very important that you're willing to have that open heart of saying, hey, I don't think this really makes any sense. That's a starting point to at least a conversation, which is, it's so much, even to personal animosity, right? It is so much better to go into a situation and have that conversation. Even if at the end of the day you still have to implement it and you have at least air your thoughts on it, it makes life so much more tolerable.
But Michael, it's a difficult conversation to have when the executives put their ownership on that feature. So, in other words, I've been a part of a lot of these projects where they want the network map, right? And they have their heart set. It's like their own personal, they've invested their reputation in some circumstance on a feature.
And then they get tunnel vision.
And they get tunnel vision.
And they're just focused. We need to do that. Only if we do that will all of our goals be satisfied. So, one thing that I wanted to say was, and this is sort of applicable to all of the questions you've been posing, whenever you can cite data when talking to an executive, either past historical decisions that didn't pan out within your own company, within your own team, in other parts of the industry, in other companies, with other types of applications, whenever you can cite past examples of either success or failure to back up what you're trying to say will be a success or a failure, you get more credibility. And I'm sometimes in these meetings where I'm just totally dominated by the amazing intelligence and industry savviness of the management team in the room, and I sometimes think, oh my gosh, I'm just like a little girl and I can't function, and they must be right. This guy, they've been in the industry for 30 years, and who am I? But you can take a step back and think, okay, wait, I've seen similar sort of thought processes, feature sets like this, and it didn't pan out for this type of technology. Why is that? Raise that kind of data and share that. It opens it up to more of a conversation. It makes the person who's sort of championing a feature, take a step back because they have to answer the question and think about it more.
To add to that, one of the things that we found successful is taking the word I out of the conversation, like I think you should and I don't think this is, and backing that up with data. Historically speaking, one of the things that we sometimes have the luxury of doing is saying, you want this, but your customers are asking for this. It makes it really hard to argue what your customers want. Usually it shuts the argument.
Yeah, and if you're in the position to really understand their customer base and you have that information, share it.
Yeah.
If you do. Otherwise, the natural response to that is going to be, how the hell do you know what my customer wants?
Be able to back it up. Never lie.
So just to completely disagree with you, I'd rather put I as much in the conversation as possible.
I'm surprised.
That's just you.
I'm surprised.
Not as in, and there's a way to do this and there's a way not to. Not, I think you're an idiot. You got the chops, that's one way to go, okay? But I'm not saying you have to say I think you're an idiot, but...
I don't know if that's chops.
So the point is that it's, in my opinion at least, right? You have to decide at some point in life who you are, and any decision is viable. I have a preference, but any decision is viable. But if I'm going to sit there just because somebody's invested in something, and I'm not going to personally take a stand and disagree, then I might as well be a yes man. And that's not me. I would much rather sit there and say, not that I think you're an idiot for doing this, but look, I have some concerns about this. And this is me. I'll let you in a second. I have some concerns about this.
I think what you're talking about is not, it's an opinion, but it's also taking ownership in the decisions you're making. Correct. Which is extremely valuable in development.
I just don't, you know, personally, if somebody's reporting to me, I don't have time for somebody who's not willing to disagree with me.
Yeah.
So I claim that you are acting immature.
Cool.
And the other thing is, you also got to figure that you're talking to a human. They have, you know, some sensibilities and feelings, and when certain people, you got red hair. You Irish?
So the claim is
because I'm
racial. We are not.
So it's cultural. So amongst Irish, you know, my family's Irish. My wife comes over to my family at Thanksgiving. We're arguing about everything. It's the greatest thing in the world. That level of argumentation to that degree amongst her family is like, oh my God, this is just. So some people take to that. I think very few. I think most people.
And to answer your question, by the way, I'm half Irish and half Italian, so all I do is argue. However, really quickly to hit something on that, it's in the way that we do things, right? You can disagree with somebody in lots of different ways. But I guess the point I was trying to get to here is that I don't want to deflect the disagreement to somebody else. I want to be clear that I disagree, but there's valid reasons why I disagree. So I'm not advocating just starting an argument for in this case. I'm not advocating just starting an argument for starting an argument. But I am saying that I don't like the idea of removing the personal ownership, that I, as a person, have an opinion and I disagree, because I think that's the first step down a really bad slope of getting yourself removed from the process and of people not noticing that you have an opinion and that you, in fact, are a human being. So, you know, just to kind of counter, I like being human and humans have opinions.
Yeah, I think it's more effective just to use the data.
Question over there.
Yeah, a lot of times when I'm going to make this kind of recommendation, the client is very fixated on, and I'll talk about clients on, you know, executive management. The client is very fixated on whatever it was they wanted. And then down the line, when it turns out that all my concerns were gone out, somehow it comes back around and it worked and it ran over budget. And all that. How do you handle when the consequences come around of their decision that somehow it's your fault?
EYA. So the question was for the rest of the audience, what do you do when you make a recommendation, they don't follow it, and the act of not following it results in it going wrong like you expected, and they point their finger back at you? Wow, I wish that never happened to us. But I think that's part A. It's just part of being in the services industry, unfortunately, to some small degree. There is a, you know, if you have the choice of being a developer in a services company, or the person working for the company you're the vendor to, the vendor is always going to get kicked. Always. So you have to get, what we do is you have to get really good at covering your bases and making sure your recommendations are documented 2 and 3 times over and communicated all the time. That's one of the things that we do. I don't know if you guys want to add to that.
Yeah, it's a pain in the ass to do it, but you have to have a paper trail a mile long.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
And if you don't, then you're opening yourself up to all sorts of, you know, accusations and stuff like that.
There's just no, as a services company, and I realize not everybody here is part of a services company, but it's still a good practice, even if you're working for an enterprise.
Follow up every conversation with an email. So I'm just confirming if you want me to do X.
Yeah.
Just document everything, and that way, you know, when it does hit the fan, you know, you can come back and say, well, you know, yes, you want me to do that.
I think it can help a lot too if you can provide some sort of, I don't know, early warning signs that the failure is coming. So if you can tell them, I think you should do X instead of Y. They go with Y, and then you start to see a problem coming on the horizon before it, you know, tanks the system or crashes the mainframe or whatever bad thing's about to happen. If you can tell them, hey, I noticed that because of a decision that was made back here, I think that this is what's about to happen, and here's some ways we can mitigate it. I think it goes a long way towards solving them, towards convincing the client that even though I wasn't in line with this decision, I'm still trying to make the right calls for you, and this is what I see as about to happen. We can still act, we can still stop this.
Yeah. You know, I'm sorry, what did you say?
So
Yeah, I mean, at some point, if they make bad decisions and they blame you, it's
time to find a new client. If you have the luxury.
Well, and it's true. At the end of the day, it's true is that, to be clear, everyone, myself included, sucks at various things. And, you know, when, I know, just one or two. And when, but you know, the reality is that sometimes it's just not the right relationship. And I know that's extremely hard, especially if you're a small organization or a small business. I mean, the company I work for is much smaller than any of the other ones on the stage, okay? And so a client's a very valuable thing. You don't want to lose a client, you don't want to do those things. But sometimes to your own personal health, if you're an independent person, or for the corporation's health, there are just clients and there are just people who are never going to be satisfied and they're always going to make those decisions.
But even in our early days in Effective UI, we actually have to let a client go.
Right, it happens.
It was an important client, but at some point you just stop making money and you start, and you're always spending more time arguing than.
And it becomes a liability.
Yeah.
It becomes a liability.
It's rare. You know,
it becomes a liability, and there is a percentage, and there's a school of thought which indicates that you should fire clients regularly. That you should fire clients at certain points because it's a healthy thing. It's something good for you, it's something good for them.
And we'll take one more question on this, or two more real quick ones.
I got more of a rhetorical question. Is there such thing as stupid user? I mean,
no.
You can develop something and you can actually put training in front of them, they'll figure it out. But in the end, are they stupid?
No. So, not a rhetorical answer, no. There is no such thing as a stupid user. If you haven't done the research to understand what that user is going to find intuitive, like an individual, maybe. But if you're building software for one person, you're in the wrong business. But as a general rule, if you have a base of users that are understanding what you're doing, you can blame the fact that you didn't have the budget to do the proper user research. That's fine. But at the end, it's our job as technologists to figure out a way to make software useful for people. We're in the people business. We know we like writing code, but what is technology for but to improve humanity? I know that's a little bit lofty, but that's truthfully what we're doing. You had a question over here?
Yeah, just a comment maybe. I didn't mean to end the discussion on it, but I think to a certain degree, if you're in charge of that relationship with the client, no matter what their expectation is, you have some responsibility for that. And if you find yourself at the end, there's some point where you fail in that relationship. And it may have been they scope creeped you and you didn't upfront say, this is affecting our deadline. Or, they had expectations and you didn't reset upfront. At that point where you didn't reset those expectations, you gained responsibility for that.
Yeah.
From a developer background, that's a hard thing to learn. But
Ben, the only argument I have to that is there are some clients there are some executives that operate in a manner that they're only cost driven, and the way they get their biggest bang for the buck is they narrow you down and beat you up until you're just like, hey, I'm done. You guys win. Find somebody else to beat up. You're absolutely right. At some point, you can take it on your failure, but that's really hard to decipher once you're just going into brand new.
Look for a way to fire them.
Yeah, exactly. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on here.
So basically, I thought the best approach would be to repeat exactly what you told me in the first call and shuffle the words around a bit.
And this is, by the way, if you Google Truth in Advertising, it's a great little video clip. I edited out a lot of things that are inappropriate for our mixed audience, but it's a really funny thing if you want to go through the whole thing. So we often are found in situations, and I'm sure you guys are as well, of having to, what do you do if you need an act of Congress to get anything done within an organization? Are there any ways that design by committee works? You can hold that up.
Eva?
We were talking about this at lunch. So it can be hard. Okay, I think the way to avoid this is to make sure that there is, at every step of the way, a clear decision maker or set of decision makers. If you leave it up to too many people, it's like, too many chefs in the kitchen or whatever that phrase is. And you stagnate, you stall. And that's time off the schedule, that's wasted money, and it's horrible. And I've actually modeled my sort of management style, meeting, running style around some people I've seen at work who, the clock is ticking, we have a 1 hour meeting to make a decision, it's like 2:55, and we haven't gotten anywhere close to a decision. You need to know who the person is in the room that you can turn to and be like, okay, help unblock us. And the person just needs to make a decision so that everyone is unblocked and we can move forward and we can progress. Maybe that's not the right decision then and there, but it's something to let people go forward. You can always course correct and iterate. And so what we do at Adobe is we have a very clear model for decision making. It's called DASI, actually. There's the decider, an approver, a committee, and the informed. So the decider is basically going to cull together all the options and put forward the recommendation. The approver is going to make the ultimate choice. The committee is sort of the tiger team that's involved with getting all of the possible scenarios on the table. And the informed are the people who just need to be told about what the ultimate decision is because it somehow affects what they're doing. And with that process in place, we can totally rat hole in a meeting, like a design meeting, for hours and hours and hours, which is very frustrating. I hate accepting meetings that are longer than 2 hours because I know that it's just not going to be a worthwhile usage of my time. But you at least at the end of the day have someone to point to be like, okay, well now you've heard all of the scenarios, think about it and come back with a decision. So having a clear set of decision makers. And that can be hard in companies which are more flat hierarchical-wise, like it's not very top-down. And lots of companies work that way. I mean, Google works that way. They don't have like a super high hierarchical management chain. You still need someone who ultimately will be making the decision. That's why, we have architects on the Flex team. We have several principal scientists on the Flex team. We have a product manager. So, some set of decisions land on my desk as the sort of, go ahead, make a decision. And if you make the wrong decision, you find out pretty quickly it was the wrong decision. And you course correct. But you need to keep moving forward and progressing. This whole committee nonsense, you're going to stagnate, you're going to waste weeks and weeks, and it can be really frustrating. And as part of that, I think Michael's suggestion about you can make what was it, something, or 3 options and a recommendation. That's like something that gets people to unblock and stay in progress.
So you have a luxury.
Yeah, it sounds like in a lot of these conversations we have. We don't really have clients per se. I mean, we have a customer base that we're working with, but we don't have these kind of clients who come back and say, like we're saying to you guys. We work in a different world, but for people working in enterprise companies.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me ask the audience. Maybe I'm covering a topic that's not relevant. But how many people here feel like they suffer from this design by committee or software development by committee? So enough to make this relevant. So I'll let the rest of this. Sometimes you can't avoid it. Sometimes there's 4 or 5 decision makers. How do you resolve that?
We get my 1 sentence out. That'll shut up for 4 minutes. No, you said like a lot of really important things there, right? And they all kind of were decision maker. And this isn't even necessarily a developer thing, but just an observation. Companies that usually have problems with design by committee are usually the ones, for whatever cultural reason they exist in the company, people don't feel comfortable taking responsibility or ultimate responsibility for something. Either it's been set up that way, or it's been that people who have taken responsibility weren't in some way, or whatever the case is. But usually it's just symptomatic of someone or of a situation where nobody wants to take ultimate responsibility and nobody wants to be wrong. And so all my argumentation, all the stuff I talk about, at the end of the day for me, it's just about the fact that I want people to be comfortable being wrong and to make an argument and still go on with life. So anyway, you just said decision makers, so I thought it was really relevant.
We go into projects and we ask, who's the owner of this project? Who's the one that has the final decision? And you have to hold that person to that. They can't waffle and come back to it. They're the designated decision maker, decider, and their call is the one that you go with. So you may have been designed by committee, but at the end of the like the end of the meeting, you say, okay, what's the call?
Yeah, I think we've had mixed results on this, but we try to identify we put the identification of a key stakeholder in our SOW, so that it's part of the contract that there be a point person who we can go to, even if internally they're blocked, we can sort of say like, look, you're in the contract, you're the decision maker, so you need to help us figure this out like right away, or it's going to have pretty big impacts on timeline and budget. So I think that's one thing that's helped.
I just remembered, I can't believe I blanked on this. a situation where I was working in sort of a design by committee thing for an entire year, and I almost died because it was so hard to get things done. And I started doing something that you mentioned at lunch. I work on the FXG interchange format, which is this format that defines sort of like the graphics, the common graphics model between a bunch of different tools. So that meant I was working with the Illustrator team, the Photoshop team, the Fireworks team, the Flash Catalyst team, Flash Player, or Tech. Like, basically the stakeholder meeting every Thursday morning at 7 a.m., which really sucked. It was like 20 different print products. And I was the steering person of this committee. It was really tough. And what I started doing, trying to push decisions through, was so painstaking, was that I identified basically there were 3 or 4 people that I knew if I got them on my side, if we had agreement going in, we could push the solution forward. So do consensus building outside of the committee. Get some people to support your recommendation who will agree with you and help you push it through. And that's sort of, so it doesn't all have to be at the meeting where you eventually meet as a committee. Step outside of that, identify the people who are influential, who, you know, if they say something, everyone will kind of fall in line. Get them on your side and then push something through. Maybe that's a little manipulative, but it really works.
What you're talking about is that you're going to hate this word, but you were a good salesperson.
It's okay, I've come around to that.
Yeah, but should the word sales, or do developers need to be good salespeople for ideas and for themselves?
Is that really sales though? Or is that politics? Yeah, that to me, so to me, and I'm sorry, I tried for 4 minutes, I mean 2.5. It was a good try. You know, but there's a little difference between sales. I'm good with the idea of sales, right? I'm good with the idea of selling your idea. I'm not so sure I'm good with the idea of playing the political game of trying to get, you know, things way down the background. And I have no standpoint for saying that because I'm more than willing to intimidate people into a decision. You know, and overall, this decision-making thing, I don't think it's quite
Politics makes it sound negative though, but it's kind of the reality of working in a larger group, right?
No,
and people are, you know,
well, sales can
there are people
have
who,
negative connotation as well.
right, and yeah,
in this component today.
Yeah, but the reality of it is that there are people whose opinions are going to be taken more seriously over others, and you have to build consensus. You have to call people together in a short amount of time, otherwise you're just going to be stagnating.
I agree.
Maybe it's politics, but that to me seems, well, that can be both positive and negative, but it's basically, at the end of the day, you've got to do what you need to do to move forward.
I'll give you that. It was only the word out of the meeting sort of thing. I agree with the decision maker. I agree with all those things. I agree with getting people on board. It was the out of the meeting part.
It doesn't have to be manipulative though, Mike, because I would even say that there are people who consistently see other angles than I do, right? So I think I've got the right decision, but you and I have been on a couple panels together and you frequently disagree with me and sometimes have really, really good points. And it's just something I haven't thought of before. So if we were on a committee together, you got to be darn sure I'm going to go sit in your office first and say, this is what I think, what do you think about it? Because if we can come to an agreement, I feel like it's going to be done.
And that's extremely
and more ground is covered. You've thought about more of these cases.
I'll give you that. It's a valid point. You know, to me, it struck me a little weird at first, but I think it's a valid point.
Yeah, I wouldn't really call it politics as much as I would call it managing relationships.
So be it. Yeah, I think you guys went on that one.
There's one really good word, influence.
Influence?
It's not sales, it's not politics. We all have to influence each other with,
so one of the best, as a developer, one of the best books I read was The Sales Bible.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, it was excellent to talk about how to influence your word, the decision. First of all, you have to believe in it. Like, good salesmanship is you believe in the idea. But you're right, influence. Go ahead.
If you were going to have to err on the side of safety, which one do you think is worse? Analysis paralysis or ready, fire, aim, and you realize you don't have time to force for it?
Analysis paralysis.
Why do I have to choose?
Ready?
If you had to err, if you had to make a decision,
which is better or which is worse?
Which one's worse?
Yeah, if I have to choose analysis paralysis.
Analysis is better than no decision.
Yeah, definitely. All right, we're gonna hit one more. Unless there's more questions on this, or we're gonna hit one more thing real quick before something a little bit fun. So, career limiters. We kind of added this one last minute. Curious if you've ever seen a developer do something that was you looked at and went, oh, yeah, that's he's not gonna last. I'll give you my 2 examples, and I'll hurry up.
Go ahead. Just say
the first one I actually saw at this conference about 10 minutes ago. And somebody... The first one I saw is actually a tweet that I saw about an hour and a half ago. And somebody just tweeted, I realized I'm a victim, somebody tweeted this, I'm a victim of ADD or asphalt-driven design. I hope his boss isn't following. The second one, I had the developer call me for bail money. So, really, I wonder if you guys have...
I've never been called for bail money, Anthony. I've never been called for bail money. I wasn't here. Okay. I would say the biggest thing, in all seriousness, and this applies way more than just your job, though, is excessive negativity, which kind of goes along with the thing we were talking about offering a solution. It's just extremely easy to be very difficult in any group of people you're working with. And the people who you find really valuable and who make the biggest contributions and who you want to work with again are the people who can sort of get out of that and say, okay, fine, there's some perspective on everything that says it sucks. So let's ignore that perspective a minute and let's talk about like how to make things better. What's the way forward? How do we make progress?
I think the other real glaring thing that'll limit people is pigeonholing yourself. I'm just a Flex developer. I'm just a Java developer. I'm just something. You can't afford to be just something, because it's like the point you're making at lunch. Is that technology going to be used at your company forever? You have to expand yourself.
Are you going to be in that company forever?
Well, and the one I'll throw into there, which I think is part of what we've been talking about this whole time, is the ability to communicate. Frankly, there are too many developers I've worked with who are wonderful developers, absolutely fantastic at what they do. But when it comes to communicating in any capacity, they fail. And there's ways to do this, by the way. This is a learned skill. Not everybody's born knowing how to communicate effectively. But the inability to inform your peers, inability to inform management, anyone else, or if you're working with clients, the inability to articulate your opinion in a way that's going to be understood is a huge career limiter. And that's, to me at least, that's one of the first ones I see where I see somebody that we bring on board or something like that. It's like, oh, yeah. And also, just to go along with that, along the concept of argumentation, I'm not going to look at that side of it, is the idea of passion. People who have, who are really apathetic, especially when they're just coming into things, yeah, they're probably not going to go far. This is not an industry that you can not care about what you're doing and really, either have a valid, long-term life stake in accomplishing.
Apathy is a career limiter.
Apathy is definitely.
Anybody want to add to that? No? Drew, can you give the gentleman in the blue shirt the other copy of the EffectiveUI book? I'll leave you with this one last video.
Great. Well, carry on, you overpaid jackasses.
All right, I want to thank you guys. Hopefully you found this at least fun, if not as